At the party, I saw my wife wrapped in another man's arms. So I turned and walked away without a word. This is the story of Nathan Brooks and his wife Claire Brooks. They had built something real together, a life assembled quietly, the way most lives are, through small decisions and accumulated mornings and the gradual understanding that love, once past its initial brightness, becomes something closer to habit. Nathan had always believed that stability was a form of devotion, that showing up reliably was its own language of care. Claire had believed that too, once. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that only exists inside a marriage, the kind where you are never alone and yet somehow always unseen. And Claire had been living inside it for longer than she could precisely name. What would unravel between them had been unraveling for years. The party was simply the night it became visible. This is a story about silence and what silence costs, and what it quietly contains. The house had reached that particular stage of a marriage where every object carried a history too small to mention and too heavy to ignore. The mug Nathan used each morning had a chip on the handle that Claire had noticed for 2 years without saying anything. The throw blanket on the left side of the couch was hers. The remote control was his by unspoken arrangement. These were not unhappy details. They were the texture of a life shared, and Nathan had always found comfort in texture. He was 43 and had spent most of his adult life being the kind of man who didn't require much noticing. He was competent, patient, and quietly proud. Proud in the way that people are when they've survived things they've never discussed. He had grown up in a household where money was uncertain and dignity was non-negotiable. And he had carried that combination into adulthood, building a consulting firm under a holding company name most people wouldn't recognize. He preferred it that way. The distance between Nathan Brooks, the husband, and Nathan Brooks, the professional, was not accidental. He had constructed it deliberately, the way a careful person constructs anything without announcing the construction. Claire was 39, and beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful, not loudly but persistently. She had warm brown hair she wore differently depending on her mood, and a laugh that arrived genuinely before she could manage it. She worked in arts administration, coordinating events and donor relations for a mid-sized cultural nonprofit. And she was good at her work in the specific way that people are good at things that align with their personalities. She remembered names, noticed when someone needed a drink refilled, made large rooms feel smaller and warmer without appearing to try. They had met at a conference. She had been staffing a table. He had pretended to be interested in the brochure longer than the brochure warranted. They had been married 11 years. The dinner that Tuesday was pasta, which Claire had made from memory. Nathan set the table without being asked, which was the kind of thing he did. Small, reliable gestures that said, "I am here," without ever quite saying, "I see you." They talked about her week, which had been stressful in the way work weeks are when deadlines accumulate without warning. He listened attentively, which was something she had once loved about him and had recently begun to experience as a kind of careful distance, as though he were listening from the other side of a window, present but not quite reachable. "Thomas mentioned a gallery opening Thursday," she said. "He thinks we should go." Donor relations. "Thomas," Nathan said. "From my office. You've met him." Nathan had. Thomas Hale was 34 and effortlessly charming in the way that young men sometimes are when they have not yet encountered anything that costs them. Tall, easy in conversation, the kind of person who touched your arm when making a point and made the touch feel natural. Nathan had found him pleasant enough, and had not thought much about him beyond that, which was perhaps an error of perception. "Sure," Nathan said. "Thursday works." He said it without tension and meant it without tension, and Claire felt something she couldn't name, something adjacent to disappointment, though she wouldn't have been able to explain what she had hoped he would say instead. After dinner, she sat with a book she wasn't reading. He watched a documentary about deep-sea geography that he found genuinely interesting. They existed in comfortable, parallel silence, and from the outside it would have looked like contentment. From the inside it was something quieter and more difficult. The realization arriving without fanfare that they had stopped expecting things from each other. Not out of cruelty, out of accommodation. out of the slow, well-meaning agreement that most long marriages eventually reach, to want less, to need less, to ask less, so that the architecture of the thing can remain standing. When Claire turned off her lamp and said goodnight, Nathan set it back without looking up. He would say later, much later, and only to himself, that he should have looked up. It was such a small thing. But small things, in a marriage, have a tendency to accumulate into the shape of everything. The Callaway Group annual reception was held in the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel downtown, a venue chosen for its high ceilings and the quality of light it offered in the early evening. Amber and generous, the kind of light that makes everyone look like a slightly better version of themselves. Claire had been helping coordinate donor attendance for weeks. She was comfortable at these events in a way Nathan was not. Or rather, in a way Nathan refused to be. He attended when her work required it, stood at her side to the necessary conversations, and then found a corner from which to observe the room with a drink he nursed slowly. It was not antisocial exactly. It was the behavior of a man who had learned to be present without being consumed. He was wearing the dark gray suit she had chosen for him 2 Christmases ago, the one she said made him look serious without being severe. He hadn't bought a new suit since, not out of indifference, out of the quiet conviction that the suit was fine, which it was, and that changing it would have required an acknowledgement that time had passed, which was more complicated than it seemed. The room filled gradually with the specific variety of people who attend donor receptions, well-dressed, economically comfortable, performing a version of themselves that was only slightly elevated from the genuine article. Nathan accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and let his eyes move across the room without expectation. He found Claire immediately. He always found Claire immediately in a room, which was something he had never told her, and which he recognized in this moment as a kind of private fidelity, a thing he had given her without her knowledge. She was talking with Thomas Hale. This was not surprising. Thomas was her colleague, and this was her professional event, and conversation was the entire purpose of the evening. What Nathan noticed was something subtler, the angle of her body, which was turned entirely toward Thomas in the way bodies turn when they have, unconsciously, eliminated the rest of the room. Thomas was speaking, and Claire was listening, but not in the careful, attentive way she listened to difficult things. She was listening in the open, unguarded way she listened when something pleased her. Nathan looked at this for a moment, the way you look at something familiar that has suddenly arranged itself differently, like furniture moved while you were asleep. He crossed to the bar, ordered something with ice, and stood thinking without thinking. The particular cognitive state that arrives before comprehension, when the evidence is present but the conclusion hasn't formed yet. An hour passed. The event moved through its natural rhythm. Speeches, applause, circulation, the gradual loosening that accompanies a second drink. Nathan spoke briefly with a board member he recognized from an industry event years ago, said things that were appropriate and forgotten immediately, and found his way back toward the center of the room. The string quartet had begun something slow, and a portion of the floor had opened for dancing. Not formally, just the organic emergence of couples finding each other. Nathan scanned the room again. He found her again. This time he wished he hadn't. Claire and Thomas were dancing. That alone was explicable. They were colleagues at a professional event with dancing, and people danced, but they were not dancing the way colleagues dance. They were dancing in the way that announces, to anyone watching carefully, that the physical space between two people has stopped feeling like distance and started feeling like closeness. Her head was inclined toward his shoulder. His arm was around her back with the ease of something practiced rather than improvised. Nathan stood still. He felt things in the correct order, recognition, then something cold and quiet moving through his chest. Then, and this surprised him, a strange, disorienting calm, not the performed calm of a man suppressing an outburst. Something more like the calm that arrives when you understand, at last, what you've been misunderstanding for a long time. He set his glass on a nearby table. He looked at his wife, who had not seen him and did not see him now. He looked long enough to be certain of what he was looking at, not out of self-punishment, but out of the discipline of not lying to himself. He turned and walked toward the exit, his pace unhurried, his face carrying nothing that anyone nearby would have found unusual. There is a specific kind of grief, he thought, though the thought didn't arrive in words so much as in sensation that does not announce itself, that sits down beside you quietly and waits. He recovered his coat from the attendant, stepped outside into the cool evening air, and stood for a moment on the hotel steps. The city moved around him indifferently. He thought about what he owned, not with pride, and not with the intention to use it as a weapon, but in the way that a person recalibrates, quietly, the full shape of the situation they've been misreading. The Callaway Group annual reception was held in a venue contracted through Meridian Event Holdings, which was a subsidiary of a holdings company he had quietly incorporated 14 years ago. The event itself had been organized under the auspices of a corporate partner whose name Nathan would not have expected his wife to recognize. He thought about this without deciding anything. He hailed a cab, gave his address, and rode home in the specific silence of a man who has understood something he cannot understand. He fell asleep before Claire came home, or at least he arranged himself in the posture of sleep. He was not certain which. She came home after midnight, moving through the apartment with the careful quietness of someone who believed they were entering a space already at rest. Nathan heard the soft percussion of her routine. Shoes removed, water running briefly, the light creak of the closet door, and said nothing. In the morning, he was at the kitchen counter with coffee when she came in. She was wearing the gray robe she'd had since before they were married, and her hair was still loose, and she looked, he noticed this involuntarily, like herself. Like the woman he had married, which was not a comfort. "You left early," she said. "I did." She poured herself coffee, leaned against the counter. The kitchen felt, to Nathan, very small. "I didn't see you go." "I know." She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee, which he held in both hands, and his expression was the one she had always found hardest to read. Not closed exactly, but interior, turned inward towards something she couldn't access. "Nathan, I saw you," he said, quietly, without drama, "the way you state a fact that doesn't require amplification." The silence that followed was not like other silences in their marriage. It had weight and texture. Claire set her mug on the counter with a small, deliberate motion. "It wasn't," she started. "I'm not asking you to explain it," he said. "I'm telling you I saw. That's all. That's all," she repeated, and there was something in her voice that was both relief and its opposite. The sensation of a person who has been waiting for a conversation and finds, when it arrives, that it is not the conversation they expected. "Are you angry?" she asked. He considered this. Not performatively. He actually considered it, turning the question over. "I don't know what I am," he said. "I know what I saw. I know what I've been not quite seeing for a while. And I know," he paused, the way people pause when they are being careful with themselves. "I know that the distance between us isn't something that happens suddenly." She could have deflected. She could have minimized, reframed, redirected. She was aware in this moment of all those available routes, and she also knew, with the clarity that sometimes arrives in the very moments you have most wanted to avoid, that using them would cost something she wasn't sure she could afford to lose. "No," she said, "it didn't. Do you want to talk about Thomas?" She looked at the floor. "Thomas is." She stopped. "You don't have to protect my feelings," he said without hardness. "I'm not protecting your feelings. I'm trying to be honest." She looked up. "He pays attention in a way that feels uncomplicated." She heard how this landed and added, quietly, "I know how that sounds." "It sounds true," Nathan said. She stared at him. "You're not going to yell?" "No, I mean, most people would be." "I'm not most people," he said, and then something shifted in his face. Very slightly, something that might have been sadness or might have been the expression of a man who has just heard himself say something accurate. "I'm also not the husband I should have been. I know that. I've been here, and I've been reliable, and I've been present in the technical sense. I'm not sure that's the same thing as being present." She said nothing. This was, she realized, one of the most honest things he had spoken to her in years, and it had the paradoxical effect of making her eyes sting. "I love you," she said, and then, with a slightly dislocated expression, "I don't know why I said that like it was a question." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. He thought, and this thought had an odd quality, almost as if he were addressing someone beyond the room. I don't know either. Maybe someone watching knows something I don't. Maybe I don't know, like this story, or subscribe or something. Claire blinked. What? He shook his head once. Nothing. I'm sorry. I don't know where that came from. He refilled his coffee. She watched him, uncertain. What happens now? She asked. I don't know, he said, but I think we need some space to figure out what we actually want. Not what's comfortable, what we actually want. She nodded slowly, not in agreement so much as in the recognition that this was the truest thing either of them had said in months, and that the truth of it hurt in the specific way that only accurate things hurt, not sharply, but deeply, and at the center. The weeks after Nathan moved to the guest room, a transition made without announcement or ceremony, simply a pillow carried down the hall one evening, were strange in the specific way that restructured routines are strange, identical in surface detail and utterly altered in meaning. Claire continued to work. She attended a board meeting, organized a spring fundraiser, corresponded with donors whose names she knew and whose children's names she had memorized. She was professional and capable and, by all visible measures, fine. Thomas Hale was terminated from her organization 6 days after the party. She learned this on a Tuesday afternoon from her director, who cited a violation of company ethics guidelines. Something to do with a conflict of interest, a consultancy arrangement Thomas had maintained with a corporate partner without disclosure. It was procedural language, delivered with administrative blankness. Claire accepted this information with a nod and returned to her desk and sat for a long moment looking at her monitor without seeing it. She did not, at first, connect the two events. Nathan had not mentioned Thomas again after that morning in the kitchen. He had not asked, investigated, or displayed any of the behaviors she might have expected from a man whose pride had been injured. He had simply receded, politely, non-dramatically, in a way that was somehow harder to push against than accusation would have been. It was her colleague Dana who mentioned offhandedly 2 weeks later that Thomas's conflict of interest had involved a subsidiary of Meridian Holdings, a name she repeated once, and which meant nothing to Dana and which sat in Claire's memory for 4 full days before something shifted. She looked it up on a Thursday night. Meridian Holdings, LLC. Incorporated 14 years prior. She found the public records because they were public, and followed the paper trail with the slow, methodical attention of a person who already suspects the destination. She found Nathan's name attached to it in a filing from 6 years ago, not prominently, not loudly, buried in the ordinary language of corporate documentation. She sat with this for a very long time, the event, the venue, the corporate partnership that had sponsored the evening under a name she hadn't recognized, the holding company. Her husband's name, quiet and unremarkable, at the center of it. She understood that Thomas had been fired not out of jealousy, because Nathan was not that kind of man. She understood that if Thomas had genuinely violated an ethics policy, the termination was legitimate and procedurally correct and had nothing to do with her specifically. She understood all of this with the rational part of her mind, and she also understood, and this was the part that kept her awake, that Nathan had known the entire architecture of the evening, had stood in a room he effectively owned, watched what he watched, and walked out without a word, had let the institutional weight of a thing he had built quietly over years do something that a thrown glass and a raised voice could never have accomplished, demonstrate with absolute precision the difference between what is seen and what is understood. She thought about how she had interpreted his silence. She had read it at first as passivity, as the absence of feeling rather than its containment. She had, in the weeks after, quietly revised the story she told herself. Nathan was emotionally unavailable. She had simply been seeking warmth. The situation was complicated and not anyone's fault in particular. She had told a version of this to Dana once, carefully, without specifics, and Dana had nodded in the way friends nod when they are being supportive without being honest. Now Claire sat in the quiet apartment, Nathan's presence still in it, his running shoes by the door, his books on the shelf, his half-finished coffee from the morning still on the counter. and she felt the story she had been telling herself go soft, like something left in rain. She was not a villain in this story. She knew that. She had been lonely in a real way, reaching for something real. But she had also been careless with something that deserved more care. And she had read Nathan's steadiness as indifference when it may have been, all along, a different and quieter form of love, one she had stopped knowing how to receive. He had never raised his voice. He had never made a scene. And somehow that was the thing she could not stop thinking about. The terrible, instructive dignity of a man who had seen everything and broken nothing. 4 months later, they met for coffee. This was Nathan's suggestion, delivered by text, which was unusual enough that Claire understood it was deliberate, a neutral ground, chosen carefully, a format that asked nothing and implied nothing, that offered only the possibility of conversation without requiring it to become anything particular. The cafe was not one they had frequented together. This, too, Claire understood as intentional. He was already there when she arrived. He had ordered her a flat white without asking because he had known her coffee order for 11 years, and that knowledge had not gone anywhere. And she found this small fact. The cup waiting for her on the table, so precisely painful that she had to arrange her face before sitting down. He looked well. That was her first observation, and she held it carefully. He looked like himself, but somehow more settled, as though whatever reorganization had occurred in the last several months had arrived somewhere quiet and stable. He had always been a man who carried himself with a kind of considered dignity, but it had sometimes struck her as a form of armor. Now it seemed less armored and more simply true. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Of course," she said. And then, because she had rehearsed nothing and found that rehearsal felt dishonest, "I found out about Meridian." He nodded once. His expression did not change. "I didn't know how to bring it up," she continued. "I didn't know if you wanted me to know. The records are public," he said. "Nathan." He looked at her steadily. He had always had this quality, stillness under her gaze, that she had once found reassuring and had, at some point, begun to find opaque. Looking at him now, she couldn't quite reconstruct when the transition had happened, or whether it had been his stillness that changed, or her reading of it. "Thomas was terminated for a legitimate reason," he said. "He had a consulting arrangement that created a conflict. That's documented." "I know. I want to be clear that I didn't." "I know," she said again. "I know you didn't do it out of I know." Silence settled. The cafe moved around them, a barista calling a name, the soft percussion of cups and conversation. "I've been thinking," she said finally, "about the night of the party. About you leaving." "Okay. I thought it meant you didn't care." She looked at the table. "I thought it meant you had checked out, that you saw something and decided it wasn't worth your time." He said nothing. "I understand now that it wasn't that." She looked up. "But I need you to understand that I wasn't doing what I was doing because I didn't love you. I was doing it because I was disappearing." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was effortful. "I know that's not an excuse. I'm not offering it as one. I'm just—" She stopped. "I'm trying to say something true to you. I don't know if I've been doing that enough." Nathan was quiet for a long time. The coffee cooled between them. "I've been thinking about the distance too," he said. "I've been honest with myself about what I contributed to it. I was here, but I wasn't." He paused, chose the word deliberately. "Accessible. I kept thinking that showing up was enough, that being steady was enough. I didn't ask what you needed because I think I was afraid of the answer." She looked at him. Her eyes were wet, which she did not try to conceal. "What do we do?" she asked. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, a gesture so familiar that it arrived in her chest like a small, specific ache. "I don't know," he said. "I think that's probably the most honest answer I can give you." "Is there a version," she said carefully, "where we figure it out?" He considered this with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything, and she watched him consider it. And she thought that whatever happened next, whatever shape this took from here, she had, at least, stopped being invisible to him in this moment, and he had stopped being a silhouette to her. They were seeing each other finally. without the comfortable arrangements they had placed between themselves. "I don't know," he said again, "but I think we'd have to build something different, not what we had." "Because what we had wasn't enough," he said. "For either of us, even when it looked like enough from the outside." She nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee cup, held it for a moment without drinking. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the party, for all of it. Not to fix anything, just because it's true." "I know," he said. He didn't say "I forgive you," because forgiveness was not a thing that could be handed across a cafe table in a single morning. He didn't say "I love you" because love, he had learned this, slowly, at some cost, was not a declaration but an ongoing series of choices, and he was not yet sure which choices he was capable of making. He said, "I know," and she understood what was in those two words. Not absolution, not rejection, but the acknowledgement of a man who had seen her clearly at her worst, and was still sitting across from her, coffee cooling, early light coming through the window, waiting to hear what she would say next. It was not a happy ending, but it was, perhaps, the beginning of something more durable than happiness, the slow, unglamorous work of two people, deciding without certainty and without guarantee to remain legible to each other. The morning moved on around them. Neither of them spoke for a while. And in that silence, which was not the silence of avoidance, but of two people listening for what came next, there was something small and real and worth protecting.